Did you know that a rivalry between two drivers almost imploded the biggest automobile competition in the world? This is not just another story of overtaking and trophies. It is one of the most intense and dangerous chapters in Formula 1. A duel between geniuses with completely opposite worldviews, explosive personalities, and an almost irrational desire to win. Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost, two names that, alone, already carry historical weight. But together, they created a storm that shook the sport to its foundations and put at risk not only their careers, but the very integrity of Formula 1 as we know it. Imagine what happens when Senna's raw, impulsive, and almost spiritual talent collides with Prost's cold, strategic, and methodical calculation. It wasn't just a contest of who could drive better. It was a battle of philosophies, values, how one should live, and race. And what began as mutual admiration soon turned into tension, distrust, public provocations, and of course, collisions, on the track that forever marked the sport. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, maybe even make you rethink everything you've ever heard about this rivalry. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to see two teammates sabotaging each other inside and outside the pit? Or a driver publicly swearing revenge and keeping his word with the car going over 250 km/h? It sounds like a movie script, but it was all real. Formula 1 experienced it, and almost didn't survive. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the rivalry between Senna and Prost went beyond the tracks and invaded the backstage of FIA politics, the newspapers of the time, and above all, the hearts of fans. On one side, there were those who idolized Senna for his almost suicidal courage, his impossible overtaking, and his unshakable faith in himself and in something greater. On the other, there were those who deeply respected Prost's clinical reasoning, his intelligence in preserving the car, winning consistently and controlling the game like a true chess game at high speed. And you, which side would you be on? You may remember or have heard of the famous Suzuka GP. If you don't, relax because we'll get to that. But before we get into the treacherous curves of Japan, it's important to understand how the tension between these two speed monsters built, and how it went from mutual respect and even admiration to a field where winning was more important than ethics, where losing was not only painful, but humiliating, where the line between heroism and destruction became dangerously blurred. It wasn't just Senna versus Prost. It was emotion versus logic, instinct versus strategy, faith versus control. Formula 1, which has always been the stage for intense duels, has never experienced anything like it again. Because it wasn't about who was the fastest on the grid, it was about who was willing to go the furthest, literally, and sometimes too far. While the world was falling in love with the victories and the controversies, the team leaders were desperate, the managers were losing control, and the drivers themselves were trapped in a game that they themselves created, but from which, at a certain point, there seemed to be no turning back. And believe me, not even the titles won were enough to erase the hurt, the resentment, and the gestures of public provocation that marked this relationship. What you may not know is that, behind the scenes, this rivalry shaped rules, changed the behavior of future drivers, and even influenced FIA decisions for decades. Yes, the rivalry between Senna and Prost didn't just divide fans around the world, it rewrote the history of Formula 1. And while the engines roared and the tires burned, on the asphalt, off the track, the interviews were sharp as knives. Senna accused Prost of manipulating FIA decisions. Prost insinuated that Senna was reckless, even dangerous. It was an emotional and psychological tug-of-war that kept the entire world on edge and divided. Have you ever experienced this? Being in front of someone who is your complete opposite, but who somehow forces you to be better, or worse. Because deep down, Senna and Prost were that to each other, distorted mirrors. Rivals that became obsessions, idols who hated each other, or perhaps just didn't know how to deal with the respect they felt. And this is where this journey begins. In the next few minutes, you'll dive deep into the details that many have forgotten or never knew about this clash that transcended sport. We'll explore behind the scenes, listen to the most tense radio broadcasts, relive the races that stopped the world, and understand how this war almost cost everything. Because what comes now is the breaking point. Suzuka, 1989. The stage is set. Senna needs to win to keep his chances of winning the title alive. Prost, his teammate, and sworn rival, starts in front. The tension is almost palpable, spreading across the track, through the pits, over the radios, and into the homes of millions of fans around the world. What happens in that race is not just a touch of wheels. It is an explosion of everything that has been building up until that point. Frustration, pride, anger, and an uncontrollable desire to prove who was, in fact, the best. But before we go down this decisive bend in history, tell me one thing. And you, how did you experience or feel this rivalry? Even if you met these two giants after everything had already happened, it is impossible not to be moved by the weight of this story. If this subject resonates with you, leave here in the comments what touched you the most so far. Did you support Senna or Prost? Or perhaps you see them both as indispensable pieces of the same puzzle? I read each comment carefully, and your insight can add a lot to those who are also diving into this universe with us. This space is for that. Exchanging ideas, reliving memories, and, most importantly, building a community passionate about the living history of Formula One. Oh, and if you're feeling that mix of nostalgia and emotion up until now, don't forget to like the video. This really helps spread this content to more people who, like you, value these stories that have marked generations. And subscribe to the channel because there is still a lot to tell. This rivalry is just the beginning of a series of episodes that delve deep into the emotions behind the helmets and steering wheels. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Really, every click of yours helps keep alive the memory of those who accelerated not only on the tracks, but also in our hearts. Now, take a deep breath. Because what comes next is perhaps the most controversial and symbolic moment of this silent and noisy war between Senna and Prost. A scene that became a legend, and that to this day sparks heated discussions among fans, journalists, and drivers. Prepare your heart. Because Suzuka is not over yet. Suzuka still echoed in people's minds, but to understand how Formula One got to that point, we need to go back a few years. Back to a time when the tension was not yet declared, but it was already there, growing silently between cold handshakes and interviews with subtle compliments that hid sharp subtexts. It was the beginning of a rivalry that was not born of immediate hatred, but of the inevitable collision between two worlds, two mentalities, and two destinies. It was the 1980s. Formula One was undergoing a profound transformation. Technology began to invade cockpits, cars evolved, and the spectacle became increasingly global. Pilots were no longer just local heroes. They were becoming international celebrities. It was a growing sport, but with one clear trait: only the strong survived, not just in talent, but in mind. And it was in this scenario that two names emerged, ready to challenge everything and everyone: Alain Prost, the Professor. A nickname that didn't come about by chance. He thought about motor racing the way a scientist calculates a formula, with precision, patience, and absolute mastery of the variables. Prost was the driver who seemed to race with his head more than his heart. He studied his opponents, saved equipment, knew the right time to attack, and often won without being the fastest. There was a coolness in his style, but also a cruel elegance. His focus was the championship, not the individual race. This bothered some, but earned respect. And for many, it was precisely this strategic consistency that made him brilliant. On Nai, the other side, Ayrton Senna, the almost cinematic opposite, the master of rain, known for his supernatural ability in adverse conditions. While Prost analyzed millimeters of advantage, Senna seemed guided by an invisible force. Heart in his fingertips, faith in the accelerator, and a determination that exceeded the limits of reason. Senna did not race just to win. He raced to prove something, perhaps even to himself. His emotion was pure, raw, unfiltered, And that is why he magnetized crowds. Wherever he went, looks turned, voices fell. Silent and time seemed to slow down for an instant. The first interactions between the two were not hostile, quite the contrary. There was an evident, almost cautious respect. Senna recognized Prost as a formidable adversary. Prost saw in Senna an extraordinary talent. But this type of admiration, when poorly resolved, tends to carry an invisible tension. It is like two beasts sharing the same territory. Even without attacking, one can smell the other, the weight of their presence. They knew that one day they would have to face each other on equal terms, and when that happened, there would be no more room for diplomatic smiles. The tension began to manifest itself in small gestures. A harder look during a press conference. A technical comment that was actually a disguised provocation. A silence that said more than any answer. Behind the scenes, the teams already understood. There was something there that went beyond ordinary competition. It was a duel of mentalities, of opposing ways of understanding what it means to be a champion. While Prost calculated, Senna felt. While one saved energy for the end of the race, the other risked everything on the first corner. They were opposite poles of the same universe. And the audience was divided like never before. On one side, there were those who saw Prost as the ideal driver, intelligent, focused, with a long-term vision, a symbol of rationality. On the other, there were those who were passionate about Senna, who saw in him a free, visceral spirit, driven by something that even he could not explain. Reason versus emotion. Method versus faith. It was not just a question of cheering for the team, it was almost philosophical, as if each of us were also forced to choose between logic and instinct, between the safe path and the leap into the dark. And that was how the rivalry began to take shape. Not in collisions yet, but in speeches, glances, charged atmospheres. The stage was set. Formula One's audience was growing, the pressure was increasing, contracts were becoming more competitive, and the two knew that at some point their paths would cross with full force. And when that happened, there would be no turning back. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding how these two drivers went from respectful colleagues to sworn enemies requires delving behind the scenes. In the contracts that changed at the last minute, in the conversations on the radio muffled by the noise of the engines, in the interviews where every word was measured but every silence was a scream. It is in this space between what was said and what was experienced that the hidden truth of this rivalry lies. Senna and Prost's journey is not just a sporting dispute. It is a mirror of the decisions we make when we are placed face to face with someone who challenges us in everything. That forces us to get out of automatic mode, to question our own beliefs. And in this struggle, oftentimes, it's not just the other person who changes, it's us too. Senna became more strategic. Prost, more aggressive. Both were transformed by the impact of this intense, tense emotional coexistence. A rivalry that revealed much more than just driving techniques. It revealed what happens when ego, pride, and the will to win surpass any limit. And that's where the most controversial decisions start to appear. Moments when the line between competitiveness and obsession dissolves. When winning stops being a goal and becomes a necessity. As if proving superior to others was the only way to justify one's own existence within that world. If you got here and felt this weight, this intensity, comment below. I'm on this journey too. Because what comes next will make everything even clearer. Because the rivalry between Senna and Prost, which until then had been a latent dispute, made up of heavy silences and veiled strategies, exploded irreversibly at the end of the 1989 season. And when it exploded, it took with it any trace of diplomacy, balance, or control. The stage for this definitive rupture was the legendary Suzuka circuit in Japan, a challenging technical track, perfect for testing not only the cars, but also the driver's mentality. It was the ideal setting for a dramatic outcome, and what happened there changed everything. Senna and Prost were on the same team, McLaren, but they no longer shared the same spirit for a long time. At that point in the championship, Prost was leading the points and could have been champion even if he had not won the race. Senna needed the victory to keep his title chances alive. The tension was suffocating. When the lights went out, they both knew this wasn't just another start. It was a dispute that went far beyond trophies. It was personal. On lap 46, Senna attempts the decisive overtaking. He dives inside at the chicane, almost at the end of the lap. Prost closes the door aggressively, and the two cars collide. The impact knocks them both off the track, and for a moment, silence takes over the racetrack. Prost gets out of the car and leaves. Senna, however, with the help of the marshals, manages to return, completes the lap, enters the pits, changes the car's nose, and returns to the race. He crosses the finish line first in one of the most epic comebacks in history. But the celebration doesn't last long. Shortly after the end of the race, Senna was disqualified for returning to the track irregularly and cutting the chicane. The decision was surrounded by controversy, mainly because Jean-Marie Balestre, president of the FIA at the time, was notoriously close to Prost, a relationship that raised suspicions of favoritism and manipulation behind the scenes. Senna, furious, publicly accused the FIA of conspiracy. He spoke with his eyes burning, his blood pounding. For him, the hidden truth behind the disqualification was political and personal. The press went into an uproar. Some journalists, such as the respected Nigel Roebuck, described the episode as a scandal that tarnished the integrity of the sport. Others defended the management's stance. But amidst the smoke, one thing was clear. That touch, that punishment, and that inflammatory response from Senna had broken an invisible boundary. This was no longer an ordinary rivalry. It was a duel with no way back. And like all duels of this kind, it could only end with a high price. The impact of this spread like wildfire. McLaren, despite being victorious, was cracked. Fans were even more divided. Senna became a symbol of resistance and courage for some, of recklessness and rebellion to others. Prost, in turn, left McLaren at the end of that year, saying he could no longer work in a psychologically toxic environment. It was for Ferrari, and what was tension turned into open confrontation. And then came 1990, the reunion. Senna was now McLaren's number one, with Prost donning red and white, driving for the most traditional Formula One team. It was as if the board had been rearranged for the final chapter of a war. And ironically, or perhaps symbolically, the setting would be the same: Suzuka. This time, Senna was leading the championship. Prost needed to win, but there was a shadow hanging over that race. In the days leading up to the Grand Prix, Senna openly criticized the FIA for having reversed his position on the grid, forcing him to start on the dirty side of the track, a decision he considered unfair and dangerous. He no longer hid his resentment. This was not just a duel for points. It was a fight against the system, against what he saw as institutional manipulation and hypocrisy. And then at the start, history repeated itself, but with an even more symbolic outcome. Prost got off to a better start and took the lead. Senna in second place went straight and deliberately on for the collision. The two cars collided violently on the first corner. Both retired immediately. But with Prost's retirement, Senna secured the title, a gesture that was, at the same time, his greatest revenge and his greatest stain. An intentional accident, a victory that divided the public even more. A decision that, to this day, is discussed with narrowed eyes and hesitant voices. Behind the scenes, the mood was one of declared war. Cross statements filled the newspapers. Prost, indignant, accused Senna of being unsportsmanlike, dangerous, and inconsequential. Senna, for his part, said he had only done what was fair, giving back to the FIA and Prost what they had done to him the previous year. And while the two dueled with sharp words and symbolic gestures, Formula One tried, almost desperately, to control the damage. Because there, between 1989 and 1990, the sport was hanging by a thread. Those 2 years changed everything. Forever. They changed the way drivers competed. They changed the relationship between teams and management. They changed the public's perception of what it means to win. Because there, in that sequence of clashes, it wasn't just the lead of the race that was at stake. It was ego, honor, the narrative of a lifetime. And no narrative about Formula One would be complete without this clash. Senna and Prost weren't just jockeying for position. They were fighting for the right to be remembered as the greatest, the most complete, the most true. And this fight, unlike the Suzuka curves, had no clear finish line. It continued in the gestures, in the interviews, in what was said between the lines. It remained in their eyes when they met on the podiums, in the corridors, at press conferences. It continued even in the silences, because on some level each knew that they had been shaped by the other's presence, that without that blow maybe they wouldn't have gone so far, that the greatness of one only existed because the other was there as a mirror, as an obstacle, as a permanent challenge. Comment here. That makes sense to me, because now it's time to open a new window on this rivalry, where everything begins to take on an even more human dimension. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because after so many collisions, so many headlines and sharp statements, the inevitable question arose: how far can this go without destroying everything around it? Formula One is a spectacle, of course, but it is also a sport. And between the curves of emotion and the straits of reason, the rivalry between Senna and Prost had stretched the limit until it almost broke. There were 2 years in a row in which the line between competitiveness and destruction became dangerously thin, and the effects of this echoed throughout the structure of motorsport. The categories backstage was on alert. The FIA, under pressure like never before, began to rethink its stance, its rules, and its own authority. Credibility was at stake. The leaders understood that it was not just a matter of monitoring accidents, but of managing the psychological and political impact that such an intense rivalry could cause. After all, the world was watching. And it wasn't just about speed. It was about decisions, influence, power. It was about what Formula One was being allowed to represent. The Senna-Prost rivalry forced an institutional transformation. The rules became more rigid, the judging criteria became more transparent, at least in theory, and the relationships between teams and management gained diplomatic layers that had previously been neglected. It was as if the entire sport had received a reality check, a reminder that behind every overtaking move lies a chain of consequences that can change the course of everything. Formula One survived, yes, but it was left marked. The public image of the sport oscillated between fascination and criticism. On the one hand, the audience exploded. People wanted to see this. It was human, it was visceral, it was unpredictable. On the other hand, the ethical questioning grew. To what extent is it worth turning a championship into a battlefield? And then, as in a script that mixes drama and redemption, the unexpected happened. The moment when the armor began to fall. In 1993, Alain Prost became world champion again. It was his 4th title, and his last. The stage? Adelaide, Australia, the final race of the season. The scene that unfolded there was, for many, as powerful as any previous one. Senna, after winning that race, climbs onto the podium. He had dominated the race, but he knew that the day was not just his. And then, with a silent gesture, he calls Prost to climb the top step with him. The two embrace, a quick but sincere hug, tense but transformative, a sign that the war had come to an end. There he was no longer the Senna of blind fury nor the Prost of absolute coldness. They were two men who recognized each other in their tiredness, in their exhaustion, in the silent admiration that had perhaps always existed, only suffocated by the pressure. The impact of this gesture was immense. Those who followed closely knew something had changed, and not just between them. Sport, in some way, also breathed easier. But the most powerful part of this story was perhaps yet to come. Few knew, at the time, how much Senna had been affected by all of this. The emotional burden, the physical exhaustion, the loneliness that grew even amidst the applause. When Prost announced his retirement at the end of that year, Senna spoke about him as never before. With him leaving, something is missing in me too. We made history together. He challenged me to be better. That sentence did not sound like a simple farewell to a rival. It was a revelation. A truth that Senna, until then, seemed to have kept to himself. And then, in 1994, F1 would return to Imola. And there, on that track marked by tragedies and symbols, Ayrton Senna would do something that would move the world and leave many speechless. Over the weekend, the Brazilian discreetly placed a small French flag inside the cockpit of his car. No one really understood at the time. The broadcast didn't even mention it. But after the fatal accident that took Senna's life in that race, the flag was discovered by the stewards. And there was the last tribute. A tribute to Prost, who was no longer on the track, but remained present in Senna in a way that no one imagined. It was as if, in the end, everything had changed. The rivalry that began as a confrontation turned into recognition. The antagonism became a mirror. And the hidden truth behind that whole war was simple, yet powerful. They completed each other. One would not have been what it was without the other. The impact of this story goes far beyond trophies or statistics. She teaches us about identity, about ego, about the transformation that only happens when we are truly challenged. Senna and Prost were not just rivals. They were partners in the journey, involuntary perhaps, but indispensable. And when the checkered flag fell for the last time for Senna, there was a message there that went beyond the track, the numbers, and the titles. There was humanity. There was pain. But there was also redemption. Write it down. That makes sense to me. Because what comes now is what really gives meaning to all this. Because when the dust from the races settled, when the cars stopped, roaring and the microphones went silent, what remained of the rivalry between Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost was not just a history of victories, accidents, or controversies. What really remained was a legacy. And not just any legacy, but one that shaped the very identity of modern Formula One. One that went beyond the limits of the asphalt and invaded the collective imagination of generations who, even without ever having seen that era live, still feel the weight and beauty of that story. Today's Formula One is, in many ways, a direct product of that confrontation. The technical decisions, the level of professionalism, the safety concerns, the relationship between the media and the drivers, all of this was, in some way, influenced by the Senna and Prost years. They raised the emotional and strategic demands of the sport to a new level. They showed that being a driver was not just about lap times, but about mentality, about withstanding pressure, staying focused, dealing with external narratives that changed with every turn, with every gesture. More than that, they taught us about transformation. Because the most impressive thing about this journey was not only what each of them achieved alone, but what they built in each other, even if unintentionally. Senna needed Prost to learn to think more calmly. Prost needed Senna to rediscover the passion and risk of improvisation. And it's curious how, over time, they began to absorb traits from their rival, as if they were, little by little, mirroring each other, even as they faced each other. At times, we try to understand what attracts us so much to stories of rivalry. Perhaps it is because they reflect something deeply human, the confrontation between who we are and who we need to be. Senna and Prost personified this with an almost poetic intensity. They were extremes that complemented each other, like opposites, in a magnetic field that repels but also attracts. Each pulled the other out of their comfort zone, and it is precisely in this discomfort that true greatness often emerges. Throughout their careers, both won titles, broke records, and wrote unforgettable stories. But neither of them would have gone so far alone. Neither would have been so iconic, without the uncomfortable and necessary presence of the other. Because deep down, without Prost, perhaps the Senna we know would not exist. And without Senna, Prost perhaps would never have had to reinvent himself so many times. This is one of the most powerful hidden truths in Formula One. Its greatest idols were built on each other. And when the rivalry became a thing of the past, the respect remained. A silent, mature respect that is only possible when you recognize in the other person what you have never been able to admit out loud. He was everything I feared, and everything I needed. These are the types of encounters that change the course of an entire life, that generate a real impact, that leave marks, that cannot be erased with time or distance. The strongest images of this legacy are not only in the races. They are in the gestures off the track, in interviews with teary eyes, in restrained hugs, in silences that said much more than any victory. And of course, in that cockpit in Imola, where a small French flag reminded us that, even absent, Prost was still there. Present in Senna's thoughts, in the memory of the rivalry, in the hearts of those who knew that this was not just a tribute. It was the closing of a cycle. An emotional surrender. A way of saying, you were an essential part of my journey. And perhaps that is the most beautiful thing about all of this. We spend our lives trying to win, overcome, prove something. But in the end, what really remains are the connections. The encounters that challenged us, that took us off balance, that forced us to grow. The legacy of Senna and Prost is not just about speed, it is about humanity. Two men who pushed each other to the limit and, in doing so, found their own depth in each other. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. Because now it's time to look at this rivalry with different eyes. Eyes that see, beyond the competition, the value of the stories that transform us. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And that, to me, says it all. There were many intense moments, full of emotion, revelations, and truths that go far beyond the sport. If this type of content makes you think, feel, and see Formula One from a different perspective, take advantage and subscribe to the channel. That way we can continue together on this journey through stories that really leave a mark. Leave a simple, but meaningful sentence in the comments. I'm with you until the end. It's his way of saying that he lived this content until the last second, and that just like Senna and Prost, he understands that every great story is made up of transformative encounters. Oh, and if this video moved you, if at any point you found yourself reflecting on something bigger than speed, leave a like. It really does make a difference. It really does. It shows that this kind of conversation is worth it and deserves to continue. And look, there's a video here that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The story only gets more interesting.